The grand dining room of Aubergine, one of San Francisco's most deliberately intimidating restaurants, carried the kind of silence that cost money. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of restraint, of people who had learned to want things without raising their voices. Tara Osi moved through that silence the way water moves through stone, around obstacles, under pressure, finding the path that required the least resistance and the most precision. She carried 2 plates of pan-seared halibut on her forearms, a glass of Sancerre balanced in her right hand, and the particular expression she had perfected over 3 years of working the floor at Aubergine, attentive without being eager, present without being intrusive. Nobody in that room looked at her the way you look at a person. They looked at her the way you look at a piece of furniture that has been correctly placed. She had learned not to let that bother her, or rather, she had learned to put the part of herself that it bothered in a small, quiet room inside her chest and close the door. The halibut went to table 9 without incident, the Sancerre to table 4. She returned to the service station near the kitchen pass, checked her section, and noted that table 7 had just been seated. 3 men, power suits in the way that only men who have never had to prove themselves still wear, dark, expensive, slightly theatrical. The one in the center was already on his phone, already not looking at the menu that the host had placed in front of him, already performing the particular variety of boredom that signals to the room that a man considers himself beyond the ordinary ceremonies of dining. His name, Tara would learn from the reservation, was Clifford Barrow, not from the file on the system that said C. Barrow, party of 3, but from the way the men at his table spoke to him, or rather around him, orbiting the gravitational pull of his attention like satellites that had forgotten they were separate objects. Clifford Barrow, co-founder and CEO of Meridian Logistics, a company that had quietly absorbed 4 smaller competitors in the past 18 months, and was currently under SEC review for practices that his lawyers described as aggressive innovation. He was 47. He looked like a man who had been 47 his entire life. Tara crossed the floor to table 7 with a pitcher of still water and the particular composure she reserved for tables she could already read. "Good evening. Welcome to Aubergine. My name is Tara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you with still or sparkling water?" Barrow did not look up from his phone. One of the other men, younger, eager in the way that junior executives are eager, like dogs that have been taught to fetch but haven't yet been taught why, said, "Still for the table, thanks." Tara poured. She was precise about it. She had learned that precision is the one form of competence that people in rooms like this will actually notice, even when they're not looking. "Are you ready to hear about our tasting menu, or would you like a few more minutes?" "We know what we want," Barrow said, still not looking up. "Give me the lamb, rare. If it comes out anything above medium rare, and I won't be paying for it. The Dover sole for Marcus, and the tasting menu for Philip. He likes to be surprised." He said this last part with the faint contempt of a man describing a character flaw. "Of course," Tara said. "And for wine, would you like a recommendation to accompany? Bring the Ero 9 Barolo, the Giacomo Conterno if you have it, if not, the Mascarello." He paused, then looked up for the first time. The look was not unkind in the way that some cruelty is unkind, impulsive, hot, regrettable after the fact. It was calibrated. It was the look of a man assessing the quality of a tool. "Do you actually know what those are, or do I need to explain it to you?" Tara held his gaze for exactly the amount of time that was professional. "We have the Conterno, sir. The 2009 is an exceptional vintage, Nebbiolo, from Serralunga d'Alba, longer maceration than their standard Barolo, which gives it that characteristic structural weight. Would you like it decanted, Or do you prefer to let it open in the glass? Something shifted in Barrow's face. Not embarrassment. Men like Barrow did not feel embarrassment in the normal way. It was more like the recalibration of a system that has received unexpected data. Decanted, he said, and looked back at his phone. The junior executive, Marcus, apparently, caught Tara's eye as she collected the menus. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that says, "I see you. I'm sorry about him. I am not him, though I work for him, which I recognize is a complication." Tara smiled briefly and returned to the service station. Her colleague Brianna was waiting there with her arms crossed, one eyebrow raised in the universal language of restaurant workers who have witnessed something. "Table 7 giving you trouble." "Nothing I haven't seen," Tara said. "That's Clifford Barrow," Brianna said, lowering her voice. "He came in last spring with his wife and sent back the duck twice." Chef Renard still gets a twitch when someone mentions it. "I'll be careful with the lamb," Tara said, and went to put in the order. The trouble began, as trouble at tables like 7 often does, in the middle of the main course. Tara was refilling water at the adjacent table when she heard it. Not loudly, because Barrow was not a man who needed volume to be cutting, but clearly enough. "You know the amusing thing about places like this," Barrow was saying to Marcus and Philip, his voice carrying the particular projection of a man who doesn't care who hears because he's never had to. They hire girls like that for the same reason they buy expensive candles. For atmosphere, it doesn't actually matter if they know anything. It matters that they look like they belong. Marcus said nothing. Philip laughed the way people laugh when they need something from the person telling the joke. Tara finished pouring the water. She straightened up. She returned to the service station and stood there for a moment with both hands flat on the cold steel counter. In the small, quiet room inside her chest, something knocked on the door. She had been doing this for 3 years. Before Aubergine, she had worked the floor at a brasserie in the Mission, and before that, a hotel restaurant in Soma, where the tips were better, but the walk home felt longer. She had taken the job at Aubergine because it paid 40% more and because she needed the money, not in the vague, aspirational way that people say they need money, but in the specific, itemized, non-negotiable way that she kept in a spreadsheet on her phone. Her mother's dialysis was 4 sessions a week. The copay after insurance was $340 per session. There was the medication, the transportation, the modified diet. There was the rent on the apartment in Daly City that they shared. Her mother and her younger brother Kofi, who was 17 and should have been worrying about college applications instead of asking Tara whether the check cleared. She had a plan. It was a very specific plan. It involved 18 more months at Aubergine, a GRE score she was studying for between double shifts, and a deferred acceptance to the master's program in computational linguistics at Berkeley that she had negotiated. Because she had earned it, and because Professor Alderson had told her she was the most precise thinker he'd had in his intro seminar in 11 years. And because she had explained her situation to the graduate admissions office in a letter that was so clear and so specific and so completely without self-pity that the committee had found a way to make it work. 18 months. She had a plan. She picked up the contorno from the decanter station and walked back to table 7. The lamb arrived perfectly rare. Tara watched it leave the pass with the attention she gave to anything that went to table 7, because she had learned early that a difficult table requires perfect execution, not because difficult people deserve it, but because the only thing worse than a difficult customer is a difficult customer who is also correct. The lamb was perfect. Barrow cut into it, looked at it, and said nothing, which was, in the vocabulary of men like Barrow. The dinner continued. Tara made her rounds. She refreshed the bread. She took a dessert order from table 12. She fielded a question from table 3 about whether the pastry chef could accommodate a nut allergy, checked with the kitchen, and returned with a confirmed modification in under 4 minutes. She was good at her job. She was extraordinarily good at her job, in the way that people are extraordinarily good at things they are slightly overqualified for, which produces a particular kind of excellence that is simultaneously impressive and quietly devastating to witness. She was clearing the entree plates from table 7 when it happened. Barrow had been speaking quietly to Philip, something about a board meeting, a vote, numbers Tara registered without retaining. Then he paused, looked at Tara's hands as she stacked the plates with practiced efficiency, and said something, not to her, to Philip, in a voice low enough to be conversational, which is to say, loud enough to be heard. He said it in French. Quel dommage. Une belle fille perdue dans les tables. What a shame. A pretty girl lost among the tables. Philip chuckled. Marcus looked at the tablecloth. Tara set down the plates she was holding, carefully. She turned to face Barrow, who had already looked away, already picked up his wineglass, already decided the moment was over because he had decided it was. And Tara, who had studied French literature for 2 years at SF State before she withdrew, who had written her incomplete thesis on the rhetoric of class and condescension in 19th century French realist fiction, who had read Zola and Maupassant and Flaubert and understood with crystalline academic clarity exactly what it meant when men like Barrow used the language of culture as a weapon. Tara looked at Clifford Barrow and said, quietly, in French that was unhurried and grammatically precise, and completely without accent. Je ne suis pas perdu, monsieur. Je sais exactement où je suis. La question, c'est si vous savez où vous en êtes. Vous. I am not lost, sir. I know exactly where I am. The question is whether you know where you stand. The table went very still. Barrow looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived at his table, he looked at her as a person. Not as a piece of furniture, not as atmosphere, as a person who had just said something to him that he needed to actually hear. Philip had stopped chuckling. Marcus, Tara noticed in her peripheral vision, was pressing his lips together in the specific way of a man who is trying not to smile. Your plates, Tara said in English, pleasantly, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Can I bring you the dessert menus, or would you prefer to see the cheese selection? There was a long pause. Dessert menus, Barrow said. His voice had lost something, not its authority, exactly. Men like Barrow don't lose their authority in a single moment, it's too structurally embedded. But it had lost its casual contempt. That specific quality, the one that said I don't have to think about what I'm saying because none of this counts, was gone. Tara collected the plates and walked back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Marcus say something she couldn't quite catch, and Barrow's response, quieter now, less certain. She didn't need to hear it clearly. She could imagine its shape. In the kitchen, Chef Renard was plating a chocolate torte with the focused severity he brought to everything, including, she had been told, his annual tax filing. He looked up when Tara pushed through the door with the stack of plates. 7, she confirmed. He studied her face for a moment, the small, precise stillness that had replaced whatever expression she'd been wearing, and said, simply, good. He returned to his torte. That was the thing about Renard. He didn't ask questions. He had spent 30 years in professional kitchens, which meant he understood, in a way that required no explanation, the specific texture of being underestimated. Brianna appeared at Tara's elbow. What happened? Nothing, Tara said. Marcus is smiling like something happened. He likes the lamb, Tara said, and picked up the dessert menus. The rest of the evening passed without incident, which is to say it passed the way the rest of her evenings passed. In motion, in efficiency, in the careful navigation of other people's appetites and moods, and the many small ways that human beings signal to one another who they believe themselves to be. The check for Table 7 came to $1,847. The tip was 22%, which was generous, and came with a credit card receipt on which Barrow had written, "Nothing, Marcus." She noticed as she cleared the table after they left, had placed a folded 20 under his water glass. The kind of gesture that is private because it has to be, because it is an acknowledgement that something occurred that the architecture of the evening did not officially accommodate. She put the 20 in her apron pocket and continued clearing. She did not think about Barrow again that night, or tried not to. She thought about her mother's appointment on Thursday, and whether Kofi had submitted the FAFSA yet, and whether the GRE prep course she'd found online was actually better than the book she'd been using, and whether it mattered, and what the word precision meant in the context of language acquisition, and whether her thesis, the incomplete one, the one living in a folder on her laptop labeled unfinished, "Do not open when tired," was still worth finishing, if finishing was ever again a thing that was available to her. She walked home along the Embarcadero because the night was clear and the water was dark, and she needed 20 minutes between the restaurant and the apartment. This was not a luxury she had decided on. It was a necessity she had identified, the way she identified most necessities, precisely, without sentiment, and only after calculating what she could and couldn't afford. 3 weeks later, Tara received an email. She was on her break, sitting in the small staff room behind the kitchen, where the fluorescent light buzzed at a frequency that she had named, privately, a minor third below middle C. She was eating a container of leftover rice and going through GRE vocabulary flashcards on her phone. Perspicacious, tendentious, laconic. The email was from an address she didn't recognize, an Outlook account under the name N. Achterberg. The subject line said, "Introduction, Meridian Institute for Applied Language Research." She almost didn't open it. She had learned, over years of navigating the specific terrain of being a black woman with an academic background working in service, to be careful about emails that were not quite what they appeared. She had learned to read the difference between opportunity and exploitation, between a person who respected her intelligence and a person who wanted to borrow it. She read it once. Then again, the email was from Dr. Nadia Achterberg, director of the Meridian Institute for Applied Language Research at Stanford, a small, well-funded research unit that worked on computational approaches to language documentation and preservation. Dr. Achterberg explained that she was recruiting for a new project manager position that required a rare combination of formal linguistic training, operational precision, and the ability to manage complex stakeholder relationships. She had been given Tara's name by Professor Alderson at Berkeley, who had described her as, and here Dr. Achterberg quoted him directly, "the most methodical and linguistically intuitive student I've supervised in the last decade." She had seen Tara's incomplete thesis on the Alderson Lab's shared drive with his permission. She had read it. She had several questions about the theoretical framework in Chapter 3 if Tara was open to a conversation. The position paid $94,000 per year, plus benefits, plus a professional development stipend. It also came, the email noted, with a provision for completing deferred graduate studies on a part-time basis, which the Institute actively encouraged for researchers in Tara's profile. Tara read the email a third time. She sat very still in the staff room with its buzzing fluorescent light, her rice getting cold, the GRE flashcards dark on her phone screen. Perspicacious, she thought. Adjective, having a ready insight into things, shrewd. She thought about the incomplete thesis in the folder on her laptop. She thought about Chapter 3 and the theoretical framework she'd built around Bakhtinian dialogism and the social stratification of language registers and the section she'd stopped writing at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday when her mother called to tell her. The dialysis wasn't working as well as it had been, and she needed to come home. She thought about Clifford Barrow saying quel domage to his colleague over the ruins of a rack of lamb, as if the language he'd just shown to say it in would function as a lock that she didn't have the key to. She had always had the key. She had just been standing outside a different door. She wrote back to Dr. Achterberg that evening, after her shift, sitting at the kitchen table in the Daly City apartment while her mother slept, and Kofi did homework in the next room. She wrote the email with the care she brought to everything she wrote, precise, clear, without excessive hedging, and honest about her timeline and her constraints. She said she was very interested. She said she had questions of her own about the position structure. She said she had thoughts about Chapter 3 that she had not been able to fully articulate at the time she wrote it, but that had continued to develop in the intervening period, as ideas do when they are left alone in the dark with enough time. She said she was available for a call at his convenience. She pressed send. She closed her laptop. She listened to the sound of her brother's pen moving across paper in the next room. The call with Dr. Achterberg lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Nadia Achterberg was 53, German-Nigerian, and had the particular quality of intellectual attention that Tara associated with people who had been genuinely curious their entire lives rather than performing curiosity for professional purposes. She asked sharp questions. She listened to the answers with visible patience. When Tara made a point about the inadequacy of binary frameworks for analyzing code switching in diaspora communities, Achterberg said, yes, exactly, and here's where I think it extends further, and then extended it in a direction that Tara hadn't considered and found immediately compelling. They talked about the Institute's current projects, a documentation effort for 3 endangered West African language families, a computational model for tonal language processing, a policy brief on language rights for immigrant communities in California. They talked about what a project manager in this context actually meant, not administrative oversight, but intellectual scaffolding. Building the structures that allowed researchers to do their best work without losing sight of the real-world communities their research was meant to serve. Your thesis, Achterberg said at one point, Chapter 3. You argue that code switching is not accommodation, it's resistance, that it is, in your phrase, the grammar of survival deployed as the syntax of power. I find that framework compelling, but I want to know if you still believe it. Tara thought about standing in the dining room of Aubergine. She thought about the specific French sentence she had chosen, not the first one that came to mind, but the most precise one, the one that did what she needed it to do without excess, without heat, with the particular cool accuracy of a scalpel. More than I did when I wrote it, she said. Achterberg was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's the right answer. She gave 4 weeks' notice to the restaurant manager, a methodical man named Driscoll, who had always been fair with her, and who received the news with the particular expression of someone who had expected it and was sad that it was now actually happening. We'll miss you, he said, which in the compressed vocabulary of professional kitchens means, you were good, we knew it, we're glad to have it, and we understand that you could only stay as long as you needed to. Thank you for everything, she said, which means, I know. She worked her remaining shifts with the same precision she had always brought to the floor. The efficient pour, the read table, The perfectly timed checkback, the small genuine attentions that separated competent service from excellent service, the kind that makes people feel noticed without knowing why. On her last Friday, a couple at table 11 told Driscoll that she had been the best server they'd encountered anywhere in San Francisco, and asked if he could pass along their compliments. He told her afterward, with a slightly awkward formality that she found endearing. On her last Saturday, she served a four-top of older women who were celebrating one of their birthdays and who talked to each other with the unself-conscious ease of people who have known one another long enough to have stopped performing. They tipped her 35% and left a note on the back of the receipt that said, "You are wonderful. Whatever you do next, you will be wonderful at that too." She kept the note. She started at the Institute on a Monday in March. The office was in a converted Victorian building on the edge of campus, in a room that smelled like paper and the kind of coffee that gets made at 7 in the morning and drunk at 3 in the afternoon. Her desk had a window. Outside the window was a liquid amber tree in full leaf, brilliant in a way that made it difficult to concentrate at first, until she learned to use it as a focal point rather than a distraction. Dr. Achterberg introduced her to the team on that first morning. 6 researchers at various stages of their careers, ranging from a postdoc named Olivier, who spoke 7 languages with varying fluency and used all of them when he was thinking, to a senior researcher named Dr. Balogun, who had spent 20 years documenting Yoruba dialectal variation, and whose precision with language was of a quality Tara recognized immediately as belonging to the same category as her own, which is to say, not performed, not learned for effect, but constitutive, part of the structure of how a person moves through the world. There was a lot she didn't know yet. She wrote it all down, not as inadequacy, but as data. She had always treated not knowing as a temporary state, pending investigation. There was a lot she already knew that she hadn't known she knew until she found herself in a room where it was directly useful. The precision, the attention to register, the ability to read a situation and respond to its actual structure rather than its surface presentation. The grammar of survival she had written once, deployed as the syntax of power. She had been writing about language communities in the abstract. She had not understood, when she wrote it, that she was also writing about herself. 2 months into the job, she got a text from Marcus, the junior executive from Table 7. She had not known his last name, but his number was in her phone from a follow-up he'd sent about a private event inquiry that had never materialized. The text said, "This is Marcus Chen. I don't know if you remember me. I was at a table at Aubergine a few months ago. The one with Clifford Barrow. I wanted to reach out because I left the company last month. I've been thinking about a lot of things. One of them is the evening at Aubergine and what you said, and I wanted to say that it mattered. That's all. I hope things are going well for you." She stared at the text for a while. She thought about what to write back. She thought about the small nod he had given her when she collected the menus. She thought about the 20 under the water glass. She wrote, "Things are going very well. Thank you for saying something. It mattered too." She put her phone down and returned to the language documentation report she was working on. A structural analysis of diminishing speaker populations in 3 communities, with a framework for intervention that she had spent 2 weeks developing with Dr. Balogun, and that she believed, with the specific quiet certainty she'd always had about her best work, was genuinely useful. Outside her window, the liquid amber tree moved in the early spring wind. She thought about the thesis in the folder on her laptop. She thought about Chapter 3, and the section she'd stopped writing at 2 in the morning, and the ideas that had continued to develop in the dark, as ideas do, as everything does, when given enough time and enough room. She opened a new document. She put her hands on the keyboard. She thought about the word precision, what it means to know exactly where you are and what you're doing and why. And she began to write.